ahead and get started. So I'm Lisa Feldman Barrett. Actually, Joseph Friedman, who's helping to run this conference, works in my lab. I hired him about a year and a half ago I created a position for him in my lab for media outreach, because we have for a number of years been very interested in speaking directly to the public about the work that we do on the science of emotion and other things. And so as part of this, he asked me to come and give a science talk today, which is what I'm going to do. And so I'm going to just run through some of the myths related to the science of emotion and emotions in general, some of the things I've been talking about on podcasts to various people, including Ginger, which really begins with the notion or the observation, that there are lots of examples of fictions in science, right? That we used to believe that the sun revolved around the earth. We used to believe that the earth was flat. It sometimes takes a long time for scientific discoveries to percolate their way into, out of the silos of science and into the general public, actually even into other silos of science, where they can have an impact. And in an era where expertise is necessary, or at least some basic science literacy is necessary to be an informed citizen in a democracy, you need to be able to democratize scientific knowledge in an efficient way. I don't have to tell you that. You guys are here because of your awareness of the power of podcasting in one way or another. And in the last 18 months, I've had the opportunity to talk to a number of different podcasters about the work that we do in my lab, related to myths surrounding emotion, which have real substantial impacts for people in their lives, in their daily lives. And in fact, many of our most basic beliefs, our most cherished beliefs about what emotions are, turn out to be myths or fictions. And so, you can take the movie Inside Out. When people were interviewed, scientists were interviewed about this movie, and when the director and the folks at Pixar talked about this movie, they talked about it as representing our most up-to-date knowledge about the nature of emotion, how emotions work. And if that's correct, then supposedly we have little characters that live in our brains. One for joy, and one for sadness, one for disgust, one for fear, and one for anger. And because this film was made in the United States, joy is the leader. But in fact, that film, as adorable as it was, that cartoon was filled with or celebrating various myths or fictions about emotion. And so in much the same way that watching a Roadrunner cartoon doesn't really tell you much about physics, and watching cartoons about chemistry and mad scientists blowing up colorful liquids doesn't tell us very much about chemistry. Watching Inside Out actually didn't tell us very much about the nature of emotion either. So I'm going to talk to you very briefly about 3 fictions that are popular, not just popular in science, but popular in the media, and often appear in discussions on podcasts about the nature of emotion. Many of these are discussed in my book, but I'm just going to give you the highlights here. And so if you have questions, feel free to ask those questions while I'm talking, and if I think that we should save them till the end, save the answer to the end, then we'll do that. So the first fiction is that emotions are displayed on the face with expressions that we all recognize. So people are supposed to smile when they're happy, they're supposed to frown when they're sad, they're supposed to scowl when they're angry. Everyone around the world is supposed to be able to recognize smiles and scowls and frowns as expressions of emotion. But that turns out not to be the case. So rather than throw hundreds of different studies at you, which would be boring, and also we don't have the time for it, I'm just going to summarize the findings from literally hundreds of studies over the last couple of decades. So if you look at this person's face, How do you think she's feeling right now?
Tired.
Tired.
Looks like she's sneezing.
Sneezing, okay.
It's like she's eating something really delicious. She might be meditating.
You are the first person to say that. In fact, good job. Because in fact, people often, when I show them this picture, people say that she looks like she's tired or sad or in pain or grieving. But actually, this is my daughter Sophia, experiencing only what I can describe to you as a profound sense of pleasure. She's actually on her second chocolate drink. This is at the Chocolate Museum in Cologne, Germany. And this little sweetie is also experiencing a profound sense of pleasure. And comparing the two of them, these two images sum up what hundreds of studies tell us, which is that people move their faces in many different ways during instances of the same emotion. Now, if we just look at this little guy's eyebrow region, this is, he is making a set of movements that are typical for the symbolic expression of anger. So, for example, does anyone know who this is? So, when people look at this guy, they usually think he's angry, but in fact, when we take in the whole scene, we can see that actually he's elated. This is Jim Webb when he won the senatorial race in Virginia in 2006 and returned the control of the Senate to the Democrats. Without context, we see his face as communicating anger because, in fact, this face symbolizes anger in our culture. So not only do people move their faces in different ways during instances of the same emotion, they move their faces in exactly the same way during instances of different emotions. And so the punchline here is that when it comes to emotion, a face does not speak for itself. When you see emotion in another person, your brain is basically guessing what those facial movements mean in that particular context in which you're in. And even people who believe that they're reading others really well, that the face is a language to be read, like words on a page, even if you believe that, the fact is that your brain is doing what everybody else's brain is doing, which is guessing. And so the emotions that we seem to detect in other people actually come in part from inside our own heads. Right? You don't detect emotion, I don't detect emotion, nobody detects emotion. We're guessing. Our brains are automatically guessing, taking in not just the face, but an entire array of information. So we're making inferences. And so under the hood, what's really happening is our brains are predicting. They're using information from our past experiences in similar situations to try to give meaning to the raise of an eyebrow, or a smile, or a frown. And in this way, exactly the same facial movements, a scowl, for example, sometimes is an expression of anger. But sometimes it's an expression of confusion. Sometimes it's someone's passing gas. Sometimes it's an expression of intense concentration. So you're here now. This is my husband, Dan, who came along this afternoon with me today. But I usually tell people, that when Dan and I first started dating, it took me a long time to realize that he makes this like full-on scowl, the stereotype of an anger expression when he's concentrating really hard. And it took me a long time to realize this. And I happened to mention it to my graduate students, and they were like, there was a collective sigh of relief. They're like, oh, you do that. We thought, everyone is so afraid to present their talks to you because you sit there with a scowl on your face. And really, I'm just concentrating really hard on everything they're saying. So, so what about those scowls? What about these expressions? These are the expressive forms that are supposedly universal. Well, it turns out that these were not actually discovered by observing people express emotions in real life. They were actually stipulated by a handful of scientists, including Charles Darwin, and then just adopted as universal truth without much research. And so if you think about what this means, what it means is that what we have really is a science of emojis, because almost all the research on emotional expressions and emotion and how we perceive emotion in others use those faces. This is relevant to people for a number of reasons, including the fact that there is a growing economy of emotion reading gadgets, apps, and algorithms, which also assume that people express and recognize exactly the same facial movements as expressions of emotion, so that emotions can be read in people's facial movements as easily as reading words on a page. And in fact, many companies already claim that they are able to do it. Really what they can do, sort of, with varying degrees of success, is detect facial movements. But that is not the same thing as reading an emotion in someone's face. And from my perspective, I think it's wonderful that companies are spending so much time and money and creativity in attempting to build these apps and so on, this technology. But what's a little mind-boggling about it is that they're wasting their efforts, which is to say that they could be putting their efforts towards actually solving the problem of how to characterize people's emotions, but instead they're kind of going with a common sense belief and then investing tremendous amounts of money, making claims that actually can't be substantiated, which is pretty unfortunate. There's a missed opportunity there. So let me just say before I go on, I just want to be really clear. I'm not saying there's no information in people's faces, right? I'm just saying that it's naive to assume that an emotion is seeking expression on the face in this kind of obligatory universal way. It's just not true.
Are you saying it's much more complicated?
Yes, I'm not just saying it's much more complicated, but it certainly is much more complicated. What I'm saying is that the connection between your internal state and your face, that it doesn't work. Your face is not a lighthouse. It's not a beacon for your internal state. And really, very serious mistakes get made when we assume that we can just detect emotion, especially cross-culturally, that we can just detect emotion in people's faces. It has a consequence for the government. Our government spent $900 million training TSA agents on the assumption that you could just read intent in someone's faces. There were congressional hearings about this, because when you waste almost $1 billion, it's kind of a thing. But for me, the more compelling examples, often come from the fact that those faces are used to teach children to, like, for example, children on the spectrum, to read emotions in others as a way of improving their social functioning, which it doesn't do. I mean, they can learn to recognize a scowl, but that doesn't in any way. There's, I think, a meta-analysis, so a statistical summary now of, I think, about 16 experiments which show that kids can learn those faces, but it doesn't improve their social functioning at all. Which, if you think about being a parent of a kid who is struggling in that way, it's infuriating, actually. And then there's the whole, the legal context. I mean, according to the Supreme Court of the United States, in order for you to get a fair, trial in this country, a jury and a judge have to be able to read your heart and your mind.
I was going to ask how are studies effective when people are displaying an emotion on their face that's not a true emotion?
Well, they're not. Well, when you say they're not displaying an emotion on their face.
Yes, but what I mean is, how good are we at telling when those emotions aren't real? So how good are we at telling when people are faking? Are trying to fit into the mold of these faces?
So when someone is deliberately posing a face, how good are we at telling? Not very good.
Okay.
Yeah. But I would say the more serious problem is that, for example, I'm I'm not even going to get to points 2 and 3 if I keep this up. But I think the more serious problem is a problem that we saw, for example, in the Dakar Tsarnaev case, the Boston Marathon bomber. Without taking, and now I'm not speaking here, I'm speaking only as a scientist, not as a citizen, and I'm very clearly he's guilty and he should be punished for what he did. So what I'm about to say is bracketed by that. But he was found guilty, as he should have been, and the jury, this was a capital case, the jury had to make a decision between life in prison or the death penalty. And in such cases, that decision is almost always based on whether or not the jury believes that the defendant is remorseful. And in this particular case, regardless of what you believe about the death penalty, whether you believe he deserved, the bombing happened a mile from my office and he was caught maybe a little over a mile from my house. We were all under lockdown for a number of days and it was a very scary time. But to be honest, he was using a very Chechen style of expression, which is you show respect to your enemy by being stoic. So he didn't express remorse in a very American way, and he was sentenced to die. He's been sentenced to die. Now, again, regardless of what your actual personal beliefs are about what he deserves as a punishment, the fact is that there's a cultural disconnect here between the way that his brain has been wired to express emotion and the way jurors in the United States would perceive it. Yes. Yes.
So, if being stoic is the way of being remorseful for that culture, what would be like if he was in being sentenced by a jury of people who are from the same background, what would be the other? What would be like the disrespectful way of presenting himself for that?
Well, Chechen culture is a culture of honor. You disrespect people by showing big displays.
Okay.
So when you are very emotional, it's just not respectful. So there are many cultures of honor. They're not all the same in the way that they regulate their communication of emotion. Yep.
I really want you to get on to point number 2.
Yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah.
In the courts, like eyewitness testimony is being debunked with memory science, and are you and your colleagues brought into courts to talk about this particular problem?
So I work with the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital, and we educate lawyers and judges and other legal actors. And so I've appeared before the Massachusetts Supreme Court to talk about this and other matters. I will just say this about eyewitness testimony. It's been known for more than 30 years, right? I mean, it's taken that long, which is, again, brings me back to the point of why it's so important, why podcasting is so important, because it brings information right directly to the public in a way that doesn't require translation by waiting for journalists to do it. The second fiction is that women are more emotional than men, and then accordingly, we have different brains, right? So we, in my lab, this is something we've studied also, and I'm just going to tell you about a typical study that we've done that sort of makes the point. If we ask women to describe themselves with questionnaires, women always describe themselves as more emotional than men, and men agree. Women are more emotional than men. But when men and women are asked to report their experiences on a moment-to-moment basis throughout the day, they report the same amount of emotion in everyday life. So when they're randomly, probed to report how they're feeling in the moment, there are no differences between men and women. Now, there are differences between people. Some people are very emotional, some people not so much. But men and women on average are the same. And, okay, yeah, your question.
No.
Yeah. No, behind
No,
you.
I can wait until you finish that.
That's okay. What's your question?
There was just a study that I read in regards to when men look at women, emotional parts of their brains light up. Making
Hold
them
that
feel
thought.
emotional.
Yeah, hold that thought.
I'm
Yeah.
holding it.
So where does the belief come from that men and women differ? And the answer is we've learned emotional stereotypes for men and women, and this influences the perceptions that we make when we're making guesses about what people's facial movements mean. When women express emotion, they're seen as being an emotional person. And when when men do the same thing, they're seen as just merely reacting to the situation. And so in science, we say that people make a dispositional attribution about women's emotion. You're showing emotion, you must be an emotional person. He's showing emotion, we make a situational, more likely to make a situational attribution, he just must be having a really hard day. And my lab has confirmed these stereotypes. So again, here is just one example. So in one series of studies, we showed people a face like this, somebody who is subtly expressing an emotion. She is subtly expressing anger. And we gave a reason for the emotion. And then later, we asked test subjects whether this person was emotional by nature or merely having a bad day. And we did this for female targets and also male targets. Here's the thing. These faces are exactly the same. We just put male and female hair on them using a program called, I think it's called Cosmo something or other. So it's anyways. And sure enough, what we found is that exactly what we hypothesized, that people more frequently saw the face with the female hair as being more emotional than the face with the male hair. So she's a bitch, and he's just having a really hard time. So on average, men and women are equally emotional. Some people are calm, right? And some people are much more passionate. So some people float in a tranquil pond, in relative quietness, and others of us are more awash in a river of agony and ecstasy, and most people are somewhere in between, but there's no difference by sex. And regardless of what you might read in magazines, in books, the female brain is not wired for emotionality, and the male brain is not wired for rationality. Emotional stereotypes, nonetheless, have a huge impact in many domains of life. For example, in the law, men and women are treated very differently for the same crime. They receive different charges and different sentences based on these stereotypes. So for example, an angry man can catch a break when he kills someone because of a crime of passion plea, that anger took him over and he was not in control of his actions. Whereas angry women are actually punished much more because they violate the stereotype of a helpless victim. And in fact, if a woman is angry during a trial where she's been raped, she's the victim, and her rapist is on trial, the defendant is on trial, if she's angry, the defendant is less likely to be seen as guilty, and it gets a lighter sentence. You also see this stereotype in business and even in the academy. Women are punished for expressing anger because it's considered normal for a man to be expressing anger, not for women. And in fact, so women are more emotional than men, with the exception of anger. Anger is the one place where men are seen as they can catch a break for being angry. When women actually are, there's a bit of a double standard for women in the sense that if they are visibly emotional, they're just confirming the stereotype, and that means that they're not in control. That's the assumption. But when they are not emotional, they are often seen as cold and untrustworthy. So when a woman is serious or assertive, which would be appropriate for a position of power or control or authority, most people think that she's being aggressive or angry. So she's a bitch, and I have to say honestly that I've very rarely ever met a woman who is in a position of control or authority who hasn't had to go through a period of being seen as a bitch. To get to the question about emotional regions of the brain, that's the third fiction we're going to take on today in the last 5 minutes. To us, it feels like emotions happen to us, that they take us over, causing us to do and say things that we would rather not. And this makes us believe that emotions come baked into some inner beast in our brains that is pre-wired from birth. But in fact, our experiences of emotion don't reveal in any way the way that brains work. And there are no emotional parts of your brain at all. So here what I'm showing you is a cross-section of a brain, and let me just tell you just a little bit about what you're looking at here. So if I were to take a cross-section of my brain, like my head this way, and I were to pop open my face as if I were looking in a mirror, that's what I would see. Well, it would be a little bloodier, but that's what I would see. And what I've done is I've outlined for you in red the amygdala. One amygdala, there's one on the other side. So this little brain region, the amygdala, is sort of like the rock star of brain regions. It shows up in lots of news stories. It's supposed to be the brain, to contain the brain circuit for fear. Sometimes people talk about it as the emotional part of the brain. And so in my lab, we have spent a number of years testing this claim. So what I'm going to show you now is a statistical summary of hundreds of studies where people were experiencing emotion while having their brain scanned in a brain scanning machine. And so across the top here are the proportions of studies which report an increase in amygdala activity. And so what we can see when we look across all the studies, for every category of emotion, you see an increase in amygdala activity in some proportion of the studies where people are experiencing that emotion. And in fact, in many, many studies that have nothing to do with emotion, you see an increase in amygdala activity. So for example, if I were to stick you in a brain scanning machine and show you a bunch of pictures of faces or scenes that you'd never seen before, they were just completely novel to you, your amygdala would go crazy. The amygdala's job is not fear. It does have a function, but its job is not fear. And just to make that point a little, just to sort of hit that point home, what I'm showing you here are two structural brain scans. This time the slice is horizontal, so you're popping off the top of the skull and looking down into the brain. This is the front of the brain here, this is the back of the brain here. These are two scans. These are monozygotic twins, sisters, who have identical amygdala lesions, so that they're circled there in color. So these women have identical genes. They grew up in the same household. They both have high school degrees. They both have similar IQs. They married very similar husbands. They live down the street from each other. BG has an impairment in her ability to experience fear and to perceive fear in others. She can experience fear under certain circumstances, but it's limited. But her sister has completely normal experiences of fear and has no difficulty perceiving fear in other people. So in just the same way that that you make lots of different movements with your face to express instances of the same emotion, our brains are capable of using more than one means, more than one recipe to make instances of fear, not all of which require an amygdala. So emotions are not complex constructions. Emotions are complex constructions. They are not simple circuits in your brain. Emotions that feel like they happen to you, right, are actually being made by you. They're being made by your brain without you being aware of it. You have no sense of authorship, you have no sense of ownership, you have no feeling of effort in the fact that your brain is constructing your emotions, but that actually is how your brain is working. And so very briefly, in the last minute, here are some things that we do know, and here what I'm doing is giving you a little tasting menu from my book. your emotions are created by your brain to control your body. That's what happens. Brains evolved to control bodies in a variety of contexts. So your brain doesn't encounter something in the world, try to figure out what it means, and then react with an emotion. Emotions are what situations mean to you. It's your brain's way of making sense of what's going on inside your own body in particular situations. So emotions aren't built into your brain from birth. They are built by your brain. Your brain, as it develops, wires itself with the capacity to make emotions as you need them. And the more emotion concepts you know, the more emotion words you know, the better you are, the more flexible you are, the bigger the menu is of emotions that you can see in others and make yourself. And we call this emotional granularity. So your emotions are not your reactions to the world. They're your constructions of what the world means, or more precisely, they're your brain's understanding of what is going on inside your own body in relation to the world around you. So your brain is basically constantly regulating your body, constantly making sense of the sensations from your body in relation to what's going on around you in the world. This is how an ache in your stomach can be hunger. That exact same ache in your stomach, if you're in a doctor's office waiting for a test, can be anxiety. And the exact same ache in your stomach can also be, if you're a judge, evidence to you a gut feeling that the defendant is guilty. This is how the jitteriness and symptoms that we sometimes experience as anxiety are exactly the same as what people experience in the run-up to a heart attack. And for anyone who's interested in hearing a story about that, you can listen to the Circle of Willis podcast, this week's episode. So the punchline is that you are the architects of your own experience. And you can read more about that from in my book or in a number of podcasts, actually, that I have posted on my website. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
I have a question.
Yes.
It's always struck me that the idea that the marker of activity in the brain, the flow of blood, seems like a pretty blunt instrument to be making.
That's why I showed you the twins.
There have to be much more things going on.
Well, yes, there are, but I mean,
I guess my point is that
no point that I've made here is based only on brain imaging studies that look at the flow of blood to make inferences about electrical activity.
what I was going to ask you is
Yeah.
comment on brain imaging studies and how they're useful or how reliable, or what's your opinion of them?
Oh, I think they're incredibly useful, actually. I mean, I think they're often misused. I think they're often misunderstood, and I think oftentimes people overclaim. But I think brain imaging studies are incredibly useful because they have revealed to us something really important, which is that the models of the mind that we have used for probably since the time of Plato are wrong. They are folk models, they are common sense models. So for example, one of the things we've learned is that there are no parts of the brain for emotion, there are no parts of the brain for cognition, there are no parts, it's not the case that there are separate parts of the brain for each experience that we have that's distinct. We've learned, for example, that neurons in what is called the visual system, so the first cortical area, for example, that receives visual input from the subcortical parts of your brain, so from the retina to through the subcortical parts to the cortex. The first region is called V1 or the primary vision cortex. That region carries information about hearing, it carries information about touch, it carries information about motor movements. So I think this I should say is not just the imprecision of brain imaging. These discoveries are then followed up with single cell recordings, sometimes in humans and also in macaque monkeys and other animals. So I think brain imaging is, I don't think you ever blame a tool. You know, tools are always useful for something in science, I think, but they are often misunderstood. So the evidence I'm showing you today is consistent. It doesn't matter whether you look at brain imaging studies or you look at single cell recording studies in humans where electrical signals are actually measured directly. Whether you look at brain lesion studies like the twins I just showed you, the findings are the same. But I think brain imaging studies are incredibly useful. They're just not, they don't tell the whole story on their own. They have considerable limitations, but every measure has a limitation, right? Yeah. Yes.
So you mentioned in that first fiction that emotions aren't displayed on the face, and in the second one, you used a study in which folks were looking at faces to determine emotions in the men and women. So could you speak to that?
You bet. So when I say emotions are displayed on the face, what I mean is that your face is not. No, I didn't say they weren't reliable either, actually. What I said was there's no one-to-one correspondence between a set of facial movements and what someone feels. But in this case, what we did is so we didn't use full stereotypes. So first of all, I'll just say this. It's very hard when you want to study something like stereotypes of how people perceive emotion, if we had used real faces of people, the variety of ways in which people express anger, we would never have been able to get that study published because we were not controlling there's still a large number of people scientists who believe that scowls are expressions of anger and that smiles are expressions of happiness. And so if we had taken, for example, used other faces of people expressing anger in situations where we knew people were angry, the criticism would have been, I don't think it's a valid one, but I'm just telling you, it would have been that we weren't controlling, we were showing non-diagnostic expressions of anger, and that's why we see the stereotype. But if we were using the universal expressions, then we would never see that problem. But in fact, it doesn't matter which faces you use, frankly. So right now we've called a database of over 600 images from very famous actors, actually, and actresses posing faces. They're given very detailed scenarios, emotional scenarios. These are people who make a living. They're very well known, all of them. They make a living by portraying emotion in a way that people find believable. And none of them, I mean, when is the last time you saw anyone ever win an Academy Award for scowling when angry? Like no one does that, because it's just not done very often. And so if we were to replicate the studies that we did with those posed faces, we would have found very much the same thing. But we would never have been able to get it published because there's still a strong belief that people scowl when they're angry. So basically what we did was we took the stereotypes and sort of toned them down in people's faces so they looked subtle. And then that's the reason why.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm sure most people perceive women as being more emotional than men. And
Both men and women.
Both, yes.
Yes.
Well, what about what about amongst people we love? Because in my own family, I consider myself way more emotional than my daughter or my wife. And so
So it's just like, basically what we're talking about here is how people use stereotypes. So when you get to know someone really well, you're much less likely to apply a stereotype to them. Just like, if you and I have never met, if you and I were to sit down and have a conversation, right, you just scowled a little bit, you sort of, right? But so if I didn't know you very well, I would start with my stereotype. And then I'd probe a little bit and think, well, is he mad? Did I say something you didn't like?
No.
And then And then we would have a conversation, and then I'd be learning something about your vocabulary of facial movements that you make. And I would be able to learn about that in relation to all the other things that you're doing, your tone of voice, your body posture, the words that you say, and so on. So it's very much the same thing for men and women, our beliefs about men and women's stereotypes. The thing is that, but in the workplace, and where you may only have access to someone in a very narrow set of circumstances. But you and your wife and everyone who knows you and your family have access to you over a broad range of circumstances, so they can learn that the stereotypes might be wrong. But the people that we work with, political candidates, we or people in defendants on a witness stand, we don't have that degree of exposure to learn about them in many, many different contexts, and so the stereotypes will be very active in those circumstances. I think we're probably out of time.
Thank you.
So, I'm happy to stay for a few minutes and answer questions outside.